So I have already made a breakdown of the trailer for Monster Hunter Wilds, trying to extract all of the more concrete information that I could get from that trailer. Link in the description if you want to check that out. But there's still so much I want to talk about in regards to Monster Hunter in general, and of course what I think will be in Monster Hunter Wilds, which means it is time to enter speculation territory. So what I primarily want to do here today is take a look back at the previous Monster Hunter games, namely Rise and World, but some stuff from the games even before them as well, of course, and then kind of speculate and theorize about what mechanics I think are likely to return, what mechanics I think aren't, and maybe just a little bit of what I hope might return on top of that. Now, something worth pointing out for those of you that don't know, the Monster Hunter games have been on a sort of repeating pattern as of late, mostly due to the fact that the games are made by two different development teams that sort of work together but stagger their releases so that they can maintain a regular release schedule. So, for example, Monster Hunter 4 was made by, let's call them Team A, and then Monster Hunter Generations was made by Team B. And Generations, in comparison to 4, was a lot more wacky and experimental, adding a ton of new mechanics to the series. Then Team A came along and released Monster Hunter World, which was a lot more toned down, again, back like Monster Hunter 4, but it did incorporate some of the better ideas from Generations while trimming a lot of the fat and some of the more excessive mechanics to make a more grounded experience again. Then of course Team B comes around again and releases Monster Hunter Rise, which once again introduces a lot more wacky over-the-top mechanics, and then now we're presumably getting Team A releasing Monster Hunter Wilds. So I think it's fair to assume that what we might expect is something more grounded, again, like Monster Hunter World and Monster Hunter 4, but potentially incorporating some of the cooler and more interesting mechanics from Monster Hunter Rise. In fact, we already kind of have direct confirmation of that, thanks to the fact that I think that the Raptor companion that they show off in the trailer is very clearly meant to be an expansion of the Palamute mechanic that was introduced in Rise. So then the question simply becomes, what other mechanics are they taking from Rise or potentially any of the other older games and are planning on expanding upon them in Monster Hunter Wilds? Well, I think that the most obvious place to start is of course with Rise's Wirebug mechanic. Wirebugs are essentially Rise's excuse to have a super move system where you can do over-the-top flashy moves that your weapon isn't normally capable of, but limited by the resource and cooldown of your Wirebug resources. In fact, it's very similar to the main mechanic they introduced in Generations, which was a much more explicit super move system that was a little bit less grounded in the world, since it was pretty much just judged by cooldown meters and whatnot, whereas Wirebugs are at least a little bit more established by having them work off of this creature that is supposed to actually exist in universe. But the overall point is that you get to do a lot of really cool flashy moves through this mechanic. However, I do think that right off the bat, this has a very low chance of making it into Monster Hunter Wilds, if only because, like I said, chances are this is going to be a much more slower-paced, down-to-earth game like Monster Hunter World, and Wirebugs are, if anything, mostly about speeding up the pace of the game by a fairly extreme amount, especially with moves like the Wirebug Recovery, where that let you get up after a hit, like, really quickly. But also just in general, based off of past events, like I said with Generations, they already introduced a very similar system like Hunter Arts, and then that system was essentially not seen again in Monster Hunter World, even if they took some of the ideas from it. So I think that that's kind of what I would expect to happen in Wilds, is maybe we'll see some Wirebug moves that just get incorporated into a weapon's moveset as a normal move that they can do now, outside of the Wirebug mechanic, but I highly doubt that Wirebugs themselves will actually make it into the next game. Plus, the B Team's games tend to have these kinds of gimmicks that are exclusive to their own games, which does help them stand out a little bit, but like I said, they just tend to not become series mainstays. Plus, just me personally, I do have some problems with how the Wirebug moves ended up playing out in the game. I don't think all of the Wirebug moves are bad, but I do think some of them are just not very well designed for the kind of game that Monster Hunter is. Like, to use my main weapon as an example with the Charge Blade, there's this one move that they have called Counter Peak Performance, which is this really powerful defensive move. And the thing is that the Charge Blade's main gimmick is all about things like managing your energy, using guard points to defend yourself, and fighting opponents or openings to use your big super amped element discharge on your opponent. Whereas Counter Peak Performance is a defensive move that is easier to pull off than a guard point, and is more easily accessible in the middle of a combo than a guard point, and it fills up your energy for free by just guarding a move, on top of also dumping it into your shield, so you don't even have to go through that step anymore, and then it also automatically combos right into your most powerful finisher. Like, it basically just skips all of the downsides of the weapon and how it plays to just let you skip to doing the cool thing right away. And that just kind of feels like it defeats the point of Monster Hunter's combat system to me. Like, a lot of the weapons have very similar moves, kind of like the Longsword's Sakura Slash and a few others. And I feel like moves that let you skip a weapon's chores just kind of cheapen the combat at least a little bit. Like, you're not just fighting a monster in Monster Hunter, you're also having to deal with the downsides of your own weapon and manage your resources and whatnot. So a mechanic that just kind of bypasses that whole aspect of the game, I feel like just isn't healthy for the game, and I really just don't see it returning in future games. But, like I said, I'm not entirely opposed to all the Wirebug moves. I do think some of them are really cool. Like, for example, I like Axe Hopper as just a cool Charge Blade move. And I wouldn't be too terribly surprised if moves like that end up just making their way into a weapon's moveset as just a new thing they can do without needing a resource. Maybe rebalanced, of course, but you get the idea. Now, the other big mechanic that was introduced in Rise were switch skills, and I think this has a much higher plausibility of showing up in a new game, because it's a lot more versatile and more straightforward of a concept. Essentially, the idea was that now, instead of your weapon having a fixed moveset, you can now swap out a handful of your moves, and you can even mix and match different types of moves in order to essentially customize your weapon more to your own playstyle. They tried a similar idea all the way back in Generations, where they added hunting styles that completely changed your moveset from the top down, and but they were a lot more fixed because you could only pick an entire style, which would change, a whole suite of moves, and you couldn't mix and match what moves you actually wanted. Like, you couldn't take one move from one style and combine it with another move from another, but that is what switch skills allow you to do, which I think is a lot more understandable and more fun to play with than hunting styles. So I think that this could maybe see a return. Plus, what it effectively lets them do is add even more playstyles to the game without even having to add more weapons. I mean, don't get me wrong, I would love to see more weapons, but adding a second playstyle to every existing weapon is kind of like getting an entire new suite of 14 weapons all over again. But to be fair, I would not be totally heartbroken to not see it return. I do think there is some appeal to the fact that weapons in most Monster Hunter games don't get upgrades in terms of new moves to unlock, because it means that your weapon has all of its available moveset all free for you at day one, which kind of helps drive home the whole idea of not only are your numbers getting better, but you yourself are getting better as you learn more of the nuances of your weapon, as opposed to having to unlock new moves that let you do new things. Again, as a Charge Blade player, for over 100 hours, I had no idea initially that guard points even existed as a mechanic. And so, like, the fact that those were just a thing I could do from day one was kind of mind-blowing when I actually learned how to use them properly. And I think that's kind of a really cool thing. And that is, I think, something that can be slightly diminished by the fact that you can just actually unlock totally different brand new moves, but I don't think it's that big a deal at the end of the day. So ultimately, personally, I wouldn't be heartbroken if they made it back, I wouldn't be heartbroken if they didn't, but I do think that, you know, it would be kind of nice to keep them in. Though, if they don't keep them in, there are some not Wirebug moves, switch skills that I kind of hope almost get spun off into their own weapon types, or otherwise get incorporated into a weapons-based moveset, again, kind of like Wirebugs. Like, for example, I really like just the way the Greatsword Surge Slash combo feels when I'm playing Greatsword with that switch skill on. It doesn't really fit the Greatsword normally, since it's all about this like very slow, big hit playstyle, but it's a really nice feeling combo that if they don't bring it back in Monster Hunter Wilds, then I kind of wish that they would add a new weapon type just to have that be the bread and butter combo for that weapon. Moving on though, another interesting mechanic that was, I believe, introduced in Sunbreak specifically is the idea of AI hunter characters. Essentially, they introduced a system where you can actually bring full-on hunters with you into a fight that can fight the monster alongside you. They're not as strong as, like, say, bringing in another player with you, of course, but, like, you could bring along, say, a hunting horn player and then have them actually, like, play buffs for you during the hunt, which is, like, way more than, like, your normal companions are usually capable of. Not to mention that they can pull off some pretty insane saves and even pull off some really cool combos of their own during a fight. And I think that this is something that they would probably be crazy to just throw away entirely. Like, if they figured out a way to have full-on AI hunters accompany you into fights, then I feel like that's probably just going to become a series mainstay, because I can't imagine it would be that hard to port it forward into new games. And then, in some ways, it could even serve as like a difficulty system. Like, they could introduce an idea where you can call upon an AI hunter to help you even if you're playing in a single player hunt, and then that way, like, if you're struggling in a fight or something, you can get that little extra bit of assistance, and then that way, you know, newer players or otherwise players that just need the help can get it if they need to. But then they could also maybe introduce a downside where, similar to playing in multiplayer, you have to kind of split the profits of your hunt with your AI companion, and so that would incentivize the players to not have to rely on them too much, so that, you know, they still learn to improve themselves and, you know, learn to hunt without them. So I think that, you know, it's a simple mechanic, but I definitely think that it's going to return in not just Wilds, but potentially every future game from now on. Let's see, what's another one? Oh, here's a big one. So, the armor skill system. This is kind of a huge mechanic, since it pretty much defines how you make a build for your character. So they've been experimenting a lot with the armor skill system in the last two games. Like, before World, the armor skill system was completely different, where armor pieces would only give you points towards a skill, and you had to reach at least 10 points in a given skill before you got any benefit from it. And as a result, you would only ever really get like 4 or 5 skills on a given armor set. And on top of that, there were also negative skills back in the day. So you had to be worried about, you know, oh, I can get a ton of attack up, but then I also get defense down on top of that. Monster Hunter World simplified it a lot, but then they introduced quite possibly my most hated thing in Monster Hunter to date. Like, don't get me wrong, I love Monster Hunter World. In fact, I love it even more than Monster Hunter Rise. But the fact that they made it so that the decorations, which are effectively the slottable skills that you can put into your armor set, they made them based entirely off of RNG. Like, you can't just craft a decoration, at least not until, like, the final update or something, that when they finally made it easier on you. And so, as a result, you can't actually, like, rely on getting all the decorations you want, and on top of that, the actual slots that you would put decorations into were just wildly nonsensical to me. Like, you would get stuff like attack gems and critical gems would be tier 1, so that you could slot them into anything. And then, like, you would get entire armor set bonuses as just a single, like, tier 2 gem. And it's like, it just didn't really make any sense. So, like, one thing I do think Rise improved upon massively from World is essentially swapping things back to a sort of middle ground between World's completely new radical armor system and a more classic style system where now you can properly craft your armor decorations once again and just kind of, you know, slot towards them. Like, obviously it still requires a fair amount of grinding in order to get all the materials to craft all those decorations, but grinding for a specific material is a lot more immensely satisfying, to me at least, than grinding just pure RNG and hoping that you get the decoration that you want. And on top of that, they also made it so that the tiers of the decorations finally makes a lot more sense. Tier 1 decorations are now specifically reserved primarily for defensive and utility skills. You know, like your standard comfort skills, like elemental resistances, defense, you know, life up, that kind of thing. Then your tier 2 decorations are more your bread and butter, like your attack and your critical up. Tier 3s when you get to the more esoteric stuff, like handicraft and your ammo ups. And then tier 4 was like the double up skill, essentially. So if I had to, like, pick one that for them to take more inspiration from, I very, very much hope that the armor skill system ends up being closer to Monster Hunter Rise in how it works mechanically, as opposed to Monster Hunter World's random RNG deco bullshit. But, you know, if I had to maybe add one other thing, I wouldn't mind seeing negative skills return. I think that that could be an interesting system where, like, maybe some armor pieces actually take away points from certain skills. And, like, they don't even have to necessarily include negative skill bonuses, which was a thing in older games, but the idea of, like, oh, this armor set gives you a lot of skills, but you basically cannot have this other skill on it because it gives you a ton of negatives in it. And so, like, that could be interesting, and I wouldn't mind if they tried to make this armor system a little bit more complex and nuanced by introducing that mechanic again. Okay, so here's actually something that I missed in my trailer analysis, and that is the fact that if you look closely at the hunter's left arm, it does look like there is a slinger there that isn't on his right arm, so it doesn't look like some kind of just detail with his armor set. I'm pretty sure that is straight up a slinger, which not only further reinforces that this game is probably going to be a lot closer to World in its mechanics, but basically all but directly confirms that the slinger as a basic mechanic will be returning in Monster Hunter Wilds, and I think that that's pretty cool. Like, the slinger was a pretty inoffensive minor mechanic. It basically just let you interact with certain items in the environment with a little bit more range to them, and you could do things, you know, like throw rocks at the monster in order to, like, anger them and get them to face you and stuff like that. So I think that overall it is a pretty solid mechanic. One thing, if I wanted to maybe go into a little bit more depth, is in Iceborne World's expansion, they introduced the Slinger burst mechanic, which is essentially the ability to fire off like a shotgun burst of Slinger ammo. And more importantly, you could do this in the middle of your weapons combos. Like, weapons effectively got a whole new set of moves where, like, while you were doing an attack, you could interrupt it and then do a slinger burst before continuing with your combo. And I thought that that was a really fun mechanic because it just added more to each weapon. Like, it was another move that you could do, and a lot of them provided some interesting utility. Like, again, with the Charge Blade, I'm going to use that as an example a lot because it's my main. During your axe attacks, you could use your Slinger Burst to sort of redirect your moves so that you would actually face the direction you want to face. So if they're introducing the Slinger again, then I certainly wouldn't mind having Slinger Bursts from the start, and maybe incorporating them even more into some of the weapons movesets, like maybe letting the, you know, Insect Glaive fire off a Slinger Burst mid-air, do some sick combos with it like that. Like, I think there's a lot of cool things that they could do with it, with a further expansion on the Slinger mechanic from Monster Hunter World. But of course, if we're going to be talking about the Slinger, then I guess I should probably touch on Iceborne's most controversial mechanic, which is, of course, the Clutch Claw. So, first of all, maybe this is a little controversial of me, but I don't think the Clutch Claw was actually that bad of a mechanic. Like, hear me out, hear me out. I still think it was bad, don't get me wrong, but it was mostly due to poor implementation, and mostly at that, it was really just poor balancing, in my opinion. Like I was saying with the Slinger Burst, I think that the Clutch Claw worked at its best when it was incorporated into a weapon's mechanics. The main problem was that a lot of weapons didn't have any built-in Clutch Claw combos, and so as a result, the only way to actually use it was to either sheath your weapon, or to just enter this sort of really awkward and not very usable Clutch Claw aiming state, which kind of sucked. But for other weapons like the Lance especially, like you could do things like the Clutch Claw counter, which was just such an immensely satisfying move to pull off that it was like, oh my god, it was just so good. So like, if they were to bring back the Clutch Claw, you know, at the very least, what they would need to do is actually incorporate it into every weapon's moveset, so you could actually do, like, a cool move with it, instead of the really boring and awkward, like, clutch aiming animation. But on top of that, of course, one of the other big issues with it was the fact that it was just like so powerful, especially with how weakness exploit worked in that game. And so as a result, it kind of felt like a necessary mechanic for a lot of people to use, which combined with the fact that it was so awkward to use for so many weapons, meant that it was just not that fun. So, at the very least, I would tone down the damage bonus you could get from weakening monsters, if not maybe even removing it entirely. Like, maybe if you just made it so that clutching onto a monster, let you do one big damaging attack, and then maybe got some free Slinger ammo in return, that would probably be enough. And then, like I said, combined with mixing it into the weapon's movesets better, that would actually, I think, make the Clutch Claw a more balanced and fun mechanic. But to be fair, I do think that the Clutch Claw is very unlikely to return in Wilds, if only due to the highly negative reception it got from the hardcore fanbase when Iceborne was first coming out. So while we're on the topic of mechanics from World, another big mechanic was the Mantle system. Essentially the ability to cover yourself in some kind of cloak that would give you some benefit like knockback resistance, or hiding you from the monsters, or automatically dodging, stuff like that. This was an interesting mechanic that it's one thing where I don't want to see it return aesthetically. Like, mechanically, the idea is fine. It's effectively just, like, an elixir that you drink and gives you a buff, and they likely would just used mantles to give it some kind of consistent visual element so that you could quickly tell who has what buff applied to them. But the problem is that the mantles, like, completely cover up your character, and in a game that's all about, you know, hunting monsters and using their parts to craft cool armor sets, hiding that armor set under a blanket just kind of is a little bit not what I was hoping for. All things told, it was a relatively minor mechanic, if we're being honest, and you know, I don't really expect to see it one-to-one translated into Wilds. I feel like that's probably going to remain a mostly world-exclusive thing. But in general, whatever mechanics we do end up seeing in Monster Hunter Wilds, I hope that we don't get anything that just covers up your character like that, because, you know, let me look at my cool character. At the very least, give me a graphical option to turn it off so that I can still see my cool armor set and everything. Like, I worked hard for that. Let me show it off. Don't make me cover it up with a blanket every 2 minutes. Now, here's a mechanic that I very much expect to see in Monster Hunter Wilds. The question is just how it's going to end up in Monster Hunter Wilds, and that is mounting. Mounting, I believe, was introduced all the way back in 4, but, you know, it's kind of gone through a bit of a journey throughout the games. It's been in every game since then, as far as I can tell, but every single game has sort of done their own take on it in some way. Like, the original version was a very straightforward, mostly mash the button before the monster knocks you off sort of, like, ordeal. Monster Hunter World sort of stepped it up a notch by allowing you to do things like move around on the monster in order to avoid it knocking you off. Like when it would slam itself into a wall, you'd want to move to a part that, you know, wasn't about to get slammed into a wall, but then it was mostly still button mashing, and then you do a finisher. And then Monster Hunter Rise just kind of went off the deep end with it by allowing you to fully take total control over the monster and then use it to attack other monsters. Now, don't get me wrong, Monster Hunter Rise, I guess, is technically the most mechanically complex version of the mechanic, especially since it incentivizes you to actually mount monsters that you're not hunting so that you can use them in a fight in order to, you know, attack your main target. But like I said, with Wilds being a little bit more grounded, I highly doubt we're going to see Wyvern riding as that game's mounting mechanic. Like, there's no way that that's going to come back, especially since, like I said, I highly doubt Wirebugs are going to come back, and Wirebugs were kind of how that was supposed to be justified. So the question is, what are they going to do? And, well, I wouldn't be surprised if it just kind of ends up something similar to World, maybe adding a little bit more complexity to it. I mean, Dragon's Dogma actually has a pretty robust mounting system where you can physically climb on the monster, and it kind of works, I guess, somewhat similarly to Shadow of the Colossus. I'll admit, I have not played Shadow of the Colossus. I know that's a sin on me. And I also really haven't played that much Dragon's Dogma, so honestly, I barely know what I'm talking about. But I do know that Dragon's Dogma is a game made by Capcom, so, you know, maybe they could share some code between them, and that could actually be interesting if you could physically climb on a monster in order to try and get to, like, a weak spot before it knocks you off, and then you do your big special attack in order to get a good chunk of damage on it. Like, that could be something. But even if it's just something as simple as Monster Hunter World's version, I think that would be fine too. But yeah, I highly doubt we're going to get something as crazy as Wyvern riding, though, back in the game. But now, I guess I might as well talk about the elephant in the room whenever anybody brings up returning mechanics in Monster Hunter, and that is underwater combat. So for those of you that don't know, all the way back in Monster Hunter 3 and Tri, which came out for the Wii originally, so this is getting pretty old now, they introduced a system where you could literally, well, as it suggests on the tin, dive into water and fight monsters on their home turf, with the main thing being that the weapon's moveset had to change quite a bit in order to accommodate the 3D movement, and of course you had an oxygen meter that you had to maintain by either returning to the surface or finding air bubbles, and if it ran out, then I'm pretty sure you only took damage. I don't remember if it just instantly killed you. It feels like it just dealt damage, but I'm not about to go back and check. And, well, this has been a pretty controversial mechanic for a lot of people, because on the one hand, obviously it adds like a whole new dimension to combat. You know, things are in 3D now. You could do some interesting things with that. But on the other hand, a lot of people just really didn't like how it played, and I gotta say, I'm in the latter camp, personally. But some hopefuls have been speculating that they actually are already hinting towards underwater combat, purely based off of the trailer, and it's mostly based on the fact that the title in the trailer is actually reflected slightly, which is like, maybe it's reflected on the surface of water, so that means underwater combat? And I mean, you know, I just think that's me. Like, trust me, I know what it feels like to reach sometimes, but that feels like it's reaching to me. Like, I don't know, maybe I'll be proven wrong later, but that just seems like not a lot to go off of. I feel like better evidence is the fact that the logo for the game seems to be hinting at some sort of Leviathan snake-like flagship, which could easily be a underwater monster. But, you know, snake monsters have also worked plenty well on land, too, so I don't think that's very definitive either. But regardless of whether or not we have any actual hints towards it, the real question is, do I think that they're actually going to bring it back? And, well, I feel like there are some legitimate reasons that are kind of inherent to underwater combat for why it may not return. Like, for one, it's pretty disorienting, and because, like, it's harder to judge your weapon's range and distance when, you know, you're in 3D space and you don't really have a ground to use as a reference point. So a lot of the time people just kind of whiff aimlessly because it's hard to really see exactly how far the monster can move. Not to mention that the monsters tend to have a lot more mobility since they can more freely swim, and the monster just kind of has to lumber about underwater. And the other issue is that, like, you have to design functionally very different feeling movesets for every single weapon when they're underwater. And the main problem with this is that because the weapons now have this entire secondary moveset, you might get into this weird situation where, like, your primary moveset that you use on land is really fun to use, but then you might not like the secondary moveset of the same weapon when it's underwater, which now puts you in this awkward position where it's like, oh, well, if I'm going to be fighting underwater, then I don't want to use this weapon that I like using on land because its underwater moveset sucks. And then you might get some kind of awkward, you know, alternate reverse situation where the underwater movement might feel better, but then you don't like how it feels on land. And so, I mean, maybe the fact that you can switch weapons is being hinted at could help, you know, alleviate that feeling. Like, you could have your secondary weapon be your underwater weapon that you swap to, and then you could swap back to your land weapon if you prefer that moveset. So, like, maybe that could help solve that problem. But I also kind of feel like, especially with how the weapons have been evolving, that you'd have to make the underwater movement very different. Like, you know, again, using Charge Blade as an example, there's this very key sliding slash move that is critical for chaining a lot of different combos together. And, you know, you can't really slide along the ground underwater, so they'd have to replace that with something that would almost certainly feel very different. And, like, to use another weapon as an example, how would Insect Glaive even work underwater anymore? Like, that weapon's whole premise is based around jumping off of the ground and flying through the air for a limited amount of time, and trying to combo to stay in the air. Like, you can't really translate that to an underwater mode, because it's like, oh, if you miss the monster, you can't, like, fall back to the ground. So, like, it would functionally be a completely different weapon in its underwater state. And like I said, you know, even if you can swap weapons, I just feel like that's a bad idea. And so, like, the only other solution is to make underwater combat somehow feel identical to above land combat. But then if you're doing that, then why are we even bothering with underwater combat in the first place? Like, I mean, maybe one version of underwater combat that they could go for is, like, instead of swimming, the hunter is just so heavy with their armor set and everything that they just sink to the bottom, and then they basically are just fighting, you know, with a blue filter around them and an oxygen meter. And, like, I won't deny that that's highly amusing. I wouldn't mind seeing that at some point, but that's not exactly, I think, what people are talking about when they talk about the idea of returning underwater combat. So, overall, I just think that it's very unlikely that underwater fighting would just even return at all. Like I said, it's another very controversial mechanic, so, like, even if they could maybe somehow make a good version of it that doesn't have anywhere near as many complaints, the fact of the matter is that it was just not a very well-received mechanic back in the day, so I just don't think that it's gonna see the light of day anytime soon. And plus, the whole point of underwater combat was to add more verticality to fights, which I think they've now accomplished in the more modern games by going more for aerial verticality and the ability to, like, climb and jump off of walls and, you know, like Wirebugs launching into the air, like all that kind of stuff. And I think that has done a good job of adding verticality and done it in a much more interesting way than anything the underwater fighting ever tried to do back in the day. Anyways, I think I should probably cut myself off at some point, since, knowing me, I could probably talk about Monster Hunter for hours. So I think that this will be the end of this video. Next time, I think I might throw together a video speculating about potential weapons that we might see in Monster Hunter, and, you know, what kinds of new weapons might get, or changes to old weapons. I think there's a lot of fun potential, and it's been a really long time since we've actually gotten a brand new weapon added to the game, so I think we're overdue for one. But for now, I think that'll do it. So as usual, I'm always happy to continue the conversation down in the comments below. Let me know what mechanics you think should or shouldn't return in the next Monster Hunter game. And if there's any mechanics I didn't talk about, feel free to let me know down in the comments as well as your thoughts on them. And maybe I'll make another video like this one where I talk about some of the other mechanics I just didn't get around to. And if you like what you saw, a like would always be appreciated, as well as a subscribe if you want to help the channel grow. And, well, I think that'll do it, so thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.